When the Confederacy was formed in early 1861, its leaders had high hopes that in the end it would contain these 15 states. However, by the end of the year, it had become clear that these 4 slave states along the border probably weren't going to join and were sticking with the Union. But given that these states maintained slavery, none of them had voted for Lincoln to be president, and that they held deep sympathies with the Confederacy, this raises the question, why did they stick with the United States instead of throwing their lot in with the Confederate states? So, the answer is actually quite complicated. And as you'll have guessed, it's not simply a case of slave states backing secession, because the picture across basically all of the slave states was complicated. Abraham Lincoln, during the 1860 election, ran on an abolitionist ticket. But it's important to note that within this camp, he was seen as a moderate. Lincoln openly opposed the expansion of slavery, but made it clear that he believed that the federal government didn't have the right to abolish slavery everywhere, and that even if it could, he wouldn't want it to. Now, most slaveholders didn't believe him, and so backed the Democratic Party, which had historically supported slavery in the Southern economies that relied upon it. The Democrats had nominated Stephen A. Douglas, a famed rival of Lincoln, as their presidential candidate, who had hoped to bridge the gap between North and South. But fun fact, no. You see, the problem with this strategy was that a certain James Buchanan was still the president, and he wasn't a fan of Douglas or his pushing of popular sovereignty. The idea that a state's population should be the one to decide on whether to allow slavery in said state or not. As such, Buchanan and other slave-owning Southern Democrats boycotted the nomination vote. They then decided to select their own nominee and went with John C. Breenidge, who campaigned on guaranteeing the rights of slave owners on a federal level and hinted that slave states maybe wanted to secede if he lost. Now, you'd think that splitting the pro-slavery vote in two would be a bad idea, but they weren't done yet. A fourth candidate, John Bell, was put forward by the Constitutional Union Party, whose policy platform was basically slavery good, secession bad. To the surprise of absolutely nobody, the unified anti-slavery Republican vote won the election, and Abraham Lincoln was on his way to the White House. And across many states, the election was actually quite close. After the election and Lincoln's triumph, it was time for secession. These states, either by legislative votes or by referenda, all chose to eventually secede from the United States, despite some of them only having been there for 5 minutes. Across the border states, there was a lot of arguing about whether or not they should stay or go. So why did they choose to stay? The first common thread within the border states was that slavery was nowhere near as vital to their economies as those that made up the Confederacy. Whilst most voters in these states were fine with the continuation of slavery, that wasn't enough to secede and risk what would likely come afterwards. So, as you'll all know, there's a scientifically proven link between your intelligence and the height of your hat. And as such, we can safely say that Lincoln was no idiot. He knew that he couldn't convince the die-hard Democrats to trust that he wouldn't take away their slaves. However, he saw these states as potentially persuadable. And he needed them to be, because if they were to leave, the Confederacy would have become a much greater threat. As such, he appointed many pro-Union Southerners to his cabinet to help convince these states that he was on their side and that he would protect slavery in the states that currently permitted it. Shockingly, this wasn't enough to prevent secessionist movements within them, and sizable chunks of their populations did favor secession. And as you'll know, political turmoil soon turned into military action, and the U.S. Civil War had begun. Almost immediately after the fighting had started, Lincoln asked the remaining states to lend their militias to the war effort. However, these states between both sides refused, and of them, these soon joined the Confederacy. The notable absence in this refusal to take up arms was Delaware, which, despite being a slave state, actually had very few slaves, and its people and politicians were overwhelmingly pro-Union. And also, even if secession had been popular, it would have been stupid anyway. Delaware didn't border any of the Confederate states, and so would have been pacified by Union forces pretty swiftly. Anyway, Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland all quickly declared their neutrality. Many folks there wished to remain in the Union, but, they had no intention of taking up arms because they just didn't want to fight their fellow Americans. And well, more selfishly, doing so would place them right on the front lines of the war. And honestly, nobody wanted that. So, Maryland was right next to the capital, and so obviously it was a state that both the Union and the Confederacy really wanted on their side. The population there was very divided on what to do, and so, there were riots. Thomas Holiday Hicks, the pro-Union governor there, soon caved to pro-Confederate voices who were pushing for a convention on secession. And so Hicks chose to hold it in a small pro-Union town. And when many secessionist legislators arrived to have their say, well, they were soon arrested, and it was decided by those who remained that Maryland would stay in the Union for now, but it would also refuse the passage of federal troops through the state. This outcome wouldn't matter much, though, because President Lincoln had declared martial law across Maryland. The legality of this was very dubious, but Lincoln had a war to win. And honestly, things like legal precedent tend to go out the window during times like this. Irrespective of what the courts thought, this action guaranteed Maryland would remain in the Union. But what about the other potential breakaways, Kentucky and Missouri? Well, the two of them were also very divided about which side to pick. In Kentucky, state legislators were pro-Union, whereas its governor was, undecided. Its politicians were fully aware of the state's divided loyalties and really didn't want conflict within its borders either. Thus, it opted to remain in the Union, but on the condition that its neutrality be respected. And the reasons that the Unionists made such concessions were that, 1, war sucks, and not dying was preferable if possible, and 2, the legislators were much older than the average Kentuckian, and the younger generations generally favored rebelling and joining the Confederacy. As such, those in the state militia were ordered to repel any troops trying to move through the state. And the governor, while disliking Lincoln and being pro-slavery, respected the decision of the legislators and told both sides to leave Kentucky alone. The Confederacy, however, didn't feel like waiting and wanted control over the state's railroads. To do this, they invaded. The Union moved in response, and the governor ordered both to leave. The legislature disagreed and blamed the Confederacy for invading first, and in response opted to join the Union cause fully. The Confederacy soon launched a large-scale invasion and occupied these lands here within which a pro-Richmond government was formed, but it didn't really have much power. That said, it did have seats in the Confederate Congress and was very much claimed by the Confederacy, and in Missouri, the story was similar. Claiborne Jackson, the governor there, was pro-Confederacy and wanted federal troops to leave the state. When they refused, Jackson called up the state militia and asked the Confederacy for help. After hearing about this, but before Jackson could make the first move, Union troops launched an offensive and forced the governor to flee the capital. As such, for most of the war, the Union was in control of most of the state, and while the Confederacy did officially consider Missouri to be a member, those from there who favored secession had essentially zero control, and the state remained in the Union in basically every way. Although when John C. Fremont, the former Republican leader, was given command of the region, he took it upon himself to proclaim the emancipation of all the state slaves and ordered the summary execution of rebelling Zorans, which obviously upset the people there. And so Lincoln quickly removed him because he was making the Union look bad. Now, as the war continued, pro-secessionist groups still existed in these border states. But obviously, they never left the Union for several reasons. The first and most obvious is that the Union controlled the legislators of the state, and pro-Confederacy individuals within state governments were either arrested or fled, and thus were stripped of their offices. They were promptly replaced by pro-Union politicians who obviously weren't going to call a convention on whether or not to leave. And so any attempts to join the Confederacy were immediately seen as illegitimate. And it's not like they could just wait for the next election. Beyond this, though, popular opinion moved against the Confederacy in all these states over time, and the idea of leaving lost its shine pretty quickly. The most evident reason was that it wasn't long until it became clear that the Confederacy was struggling. The Confederates launched numerous offensives into the border states across the Civil War, but all of these failed, meaning that pro-Union politicians still remained in charge, and when the European powers refused to recognize the CSA as an independent nation, most people saw the writing on the wall. Furthermore, even beyond the losing thing, some of the Confederate states' terms of membership were seen as a bit too restrictive. Whilst many states felt that their rights were being infringed by Washington, Richmond was also quick to centralize power during the war. For example, states within the CSA were forbidden from ever abolishing slavery, irrespective of whether or not their populations changed their mind, which for the border states in their ever-declining enslaved population was seen as an inevitable future problem. And to complicate things, there was no clarity on whether or not a state could legally secede from the Confederacy, or if it was simply stuck there forever. Also, Jefferson Davis's government introduced a national draft, which meant that the individual states had no say on whether or not their men would fight, which they had previously been able to do in the Union, although Lincoln would soon do the same. By 1864, it was painfully obvious that the Confederate states had lost, and so it was mostly a matter of time before they realized it too. And interestingly, when President Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't apply to the border states, now including West Virginia, although most of them would soon end the practice on their own terms. With Kentucky and Delaware maintaining slavery until the 13th Amendment was passed after the war was over, meaning that whilst their remaining in the Union only spared them some of the fighting, it at least meant that these states weren't rubble after the war was over. And unlike their southern brothers, they held much greater sway on how the nation would progress in the decade afterwards. And oddly, it was during the Reconstruction era that followed that many Kentuckians started to identify more with the South than the North, leading some to quip that Kentucky had only joined the Confederacy after it had lost the war. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons, James Bizernet Sky, Chappelle Katowitzka, Gustav Swan, Marvin Kassow, Winston Quood, Anthony Beckett, Wyan Hockey, Alex Schwinn, Andy McGee, Paul H. Mirza Ahmad, AF Firefly, Coppertone, Uduan, Wang Schwenin, L. Diamond Rod, D. Martin, The McWhirr Captain, Psydog Spencer, Lightfoot, Respectable Level of Chaos, Robert C. Perkins, The Flying Deutschland Castle, Bravo, Kamoon, Yun Michael Holbert, Raj Mahana Panaka, Starry Nights, Kitro, The Jim Stanham, Bonnie Bounds, Jim Sternberg, Remco Heusman, Charles I Bet Cabot, and Lord Beak.